Hello, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Space for Dialogue exhibition talk. My name is Amelia Kale, and I'm the Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming here at the Hood Museum of Art. For today's talk, I invite you to think of your questions and to leave them using the Q&A button on Zoom. The Space for Dialogue program is a series of student-curated exhibitions that the Hood has been having since 2001, and I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Grace Hanselman. Grace is a Dartmouth 20 who graduated last year with a double major in art history and studio art. For her senior year at Dartmouth, Grace was a Mellon special project intern at the Hood, working with me on several exhibitions and doing other curatorial work, such as researching and writing on objects in the collection. This year, she is an intern for Dartmouth's Studio Art Department, and I'm very pleased to report that next year she'll be starting her graduate studies in art history at Case Western Reserve University. It is my pleasure to welcome Grace.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Amelia for the introduction. I'm so excited to see this show finally come together now almost 2 years after I first started to work on it. Thank you to the Hood Museum for the wonderful opportunity, and thank you to all the mentors who helped me along the way. Let's see, I think I'm just going to share my screen. That pulled up. I think everything should look as it ought to. So let's see, there we go. So the name of my show is The Butt of the Joke, Humor in the Human Body. I waffled on my chosen topic for a pretty long time, wondering if it was substantial enough or scholarly enough, since it is at its most basic a show about butts. But I'm glad that I ended up sticking with it because humor and laughter are so incredibly important to a community's well-being. When I first started curating this exhibition, COVID hadn't disrupted our lives yet, but I hope that as the global community recovers, we can all find reasons to laugh and to smile again. And though this may be a show about ridiculous representations of the human body, the humor imbued into the works on display can convey meaning with a level of nuance that's often difficult to achieve through other means. Humor it's so multifaceted. It can be surface level and easy to understand, or it can be a gateway to much more complicated questions. And I hope all of you can appreciate the way that each of the works of art included in this show use humor to accomplish something different. Some of them are alluding to different periods in art history, and they're all responding to their respective historical moments. I wanted the work to encompass many different media and time periods. Since humor is often so unifying, it's nice to see that we often laugh about the same things that we did back then. So I'll just briefly touch on how the show is organized. The central wall, the largest one in the gallery, is my wall of butts. It is flanked on either side by sections focusing on facial expressions. And then next to the main exhibit text, there is a smaller section about other funny body parts, the bits and boobs, if you will, of the show. So despite the show being mostly about butts, it is not all about butts, but more broadly about the human body as a whole. So now I'll start giving some brief introductions to each of the pieces in the show. I'll begin at the wall of the main exhibit text and then start working clockwise. So the first piece I will show you guys here is Sonia in Her Breasts by Sonia Landy Sheridan. This is one of my favorites in the show because it exists right at the intersection of art and play. Using a double exposure process on a photocopier, the artist made it look like her face was emerging from between her breasts almost as if she was wearing her own breasts like earmuffs. And I love her smile here and the relatability of the experience of playing with a photocopier, like when kids photocopy their butts. And the absurdity and the humor there also helps to recontextualize the female nude to present it in a non-sexual manner, which gives Sonia a further level of control over her image. And then the next work is right below that. It's He Said, She Said by Daisy de Villeneuve. What we see here, whoop, next slide, there we go. What we see here is a scribbled triangle that represents pubic hair, and the text reads as follows. "You have a complicated vagina," he said. "What do you mean?" she said. "It's just complicated," he said. And the presentation of this work on the tri-hold blue line paper is super reminiscent of the kinds of drawings that you'd often find in a classroom, either as rebellion or as assertion of young sexuality. And this is perhaps the kind of drawing that first comes to mind when considering bodily humor. It's pretty childlike, kind of simple, but the text does remind us that our attempts to understand our genitalia and the genitalia of others continue throughout adulthood. And also, I think we can see there on the camera, the way I've been able to arrange these on the wall, one on top of the other. I made a little kind of homunculus with the breasts on top and the pubic hair on the bottom, which is something that I've been told that I only got away with because the topic of the show is kind of silly enough to begin with that it's sort of the only circumstance that would be appropriate. So now the next work, as we move across the doorway, is Arnaldo Tamburini's The Monk. It was painted in the late 1800s. And not a great deal is known about the artist, but we can tell by his body of work that he really just found his niche in painting jolly monks with alcohol. His kind of conspiratorial glance and the good humor in his facial expression perfectly suited the tone that I wanted to set for the show. This is the kind of face that I make when I see a butt somewhere it isn't supposed to be. So I hope a lot of the visitors to the show can see a bit of themselves in Mr. Monk here. And then right next to that is Perfect Bliss by Louis Leopold Boilly from his 1823 printing of the Profiles and Grimaces series. Boilly worked primarily in two modes, the solemn portrait and then the caricature. And as we can see here, his caricature work is often informed by that keen observation that he honed in his more professional portraits. He had a really academic interest in recording the extremes of facial expression. And I would think that what is depicted here should be relatable to many, especially perhaps to Dartmouth students and their notoriously apocalyptic drinking habits. So next in the show is a lithograph by Daumier. This lithograph is depicting the French Salon, which was an annual art exhibition that was open to the public, but generally attended by the aristocracy and aspiring members of the upper classes. The caption translates to, "I say, my man, one must have strange ideas to have one's portrait done like this." So here, Daumier depicts a crowd of people of mixed social status, exclaiming their surprise at a particularly voluptuous, classicized nude sculpture that they thought was a commissioned portrait of someone in the aristocracy. He's kind of poking fun at the subset of people who attended the salon to seem cultured, but didn't have the education or artistic background to understand art. And then to the right of the Daumier is a photogravure by Laurie Simmons titled Hot Dog. This photogravure is one of a set of 3 in a portfolio titled Food, Clothing, Shelter, which anthropomorphizes the 3 necessities for human survival. And Simmons' practice of photographing objects on legs began in the late 1980s, while a few of her earlier works were photographs of live models in scale costumes. The vast majority were of doll legs that she had sawed off the bodies and then reattached to various objects. Simmons' works are often a combination of playful and serious, and while many pieces function as a commentary on things like the practice of anthropomorphizing objects in advertising, or the tendency to build identities around our material possessions, Simmons also employed humor. Many of her works were inspired by puns, and this particular work carries a sort of body humor, given the sexual connotations of hot dogs and buns, and that's further emphasized when they're put on top of a pair of shapely legs in high heels. And then our next work, next to that, is kind of the star of the show due to its size and multicoloredness. It's a painting by Mika Rottenberg titled S12, Ass Print Number 3. Rottenberg is an Argentinian artist, most well known for her surreal video installations, where she criticizes capitalist consumption, the hypersexualization of women, among other topics. And this work, as a painting rather than a video, differs pretty significantly from her typical practice, but it still contains an echo of that performative aspect of video in its means of production. So Rottenberg, by painting on her own buttocks and then repeatedly sitting down on the paper, has created an index of her body's movement, the performance of painting, sitting, standing, and then repeating. And in using her buttocks to record the movement of her body, she's riffing on the practice of famed artists like Pollock, whose drips and splatters were meant to function as direct translations of his physical presence. However, her decision to decide to paint with her buttocks instead of a brush or other tool takes this practice of direct painting and really just turns it on its head. It kind of confuses the distinction between high and low art. So this painting ends up being a bizarre, like tongue-in-cheek halfway point between abstract expressionism and then the practice of just photocopying your own butt for giggles. She's also, as we can see, drawn back into the work a bit, populating it with a lot of the clusters of these kind of mushroom-like forms and also some scatological references. The next work in the show, next to that, is Horace Burdick's 1880 painting titled Nectarines. You can see on the wall of the gallery view there, it's quite a small painting. And you also may notice that there are no human bodies in this image. The still life of 2 nectarines that he painted was almost certainly not intended to be funny, but that doesn't mean that we can't still find humor in it today. The peach, and kind of by extension the nectarine, has gained new meaning in the age of texting and emojis. Seemingly innocent emojis like the eggplant are used as a stand-in for penises, and the peach is notorious for denoting a bottom, given its rounded shape that it's bisected. Sorry. There we go. Yeah, and then right below Burdick's Nectarines is an etching by John Cadmus titled Horseplay. Paul Cadmus's art frequently deals with themes of homoeroticism and the male nude. He was one of the first openly gay American artists and was often criticized for the erotic undertones and overtones of his work. Here, Cadmus is working from the long-standing tradition of representing the male nude, particularly in Greek statuary depicting gods and athletes. And he subverts traditions of this artistic representation by grafting the idealized male nude into the lowbrow context of a modern locker room. And you can see he's juxtaposed with these like semi-grotesque caricatures of men. And interestingly enough, Cadmus riffs on the tradition of the antique male nude by explicitly referencing the pose of a female statue, which is the Venus Callipyge, literally translated the Venus of the beautiful buttocks. I've included an image of that Venus here, and we can see how her pose maps onto the pose of the man in the print. And by doing this, he's kind of turning traditional conceptions of heterosexual attraction on their head, transforming the Venus into a male figure, but still preserving the desirability to men. And as we can see, one of the other men in the image reaches out with the presumed sexual intent of grabbing one of the nude man's prominent buttocks. And then to the right of the Cadmus painting are 3 Polaroids taken by Andy Warhol, all titled Nude Model, Male. They're typically under a drape due to light sensitivity and conservation issues, which creates kind of a fun little peekaboo effect, since when you lift the drape, you're immediately confronted with these 3 no-nonsense, in-your-face images of a man's rear end, which typically isn't what you're expecting when you're expecting art by Andy Warhol. So, but around 1970, Andy Warhol purchased a Polaroid big shot camera, and he just started taking it everywhere with him. He took Polaroids of himself, of other artists, celebrities, and just about anything else, eventually amassing a collection of hundreds of photos. And one subsection of this collection is a series that Warhol dubbed Sex Parts, in which he photographed the genitalia and buttocks of porn stars, clubgoers, and prostitutes in graphic and revealing positions. These kind of full frontal photographs, I suppose these ones aren't full frontal, these are the other way around, but they toe the line between pornography and art, and the small scale inherent in the Polaroid medium really forces the viewer to get close to intimate parts of a stranger's body, which can be both a very intimate and very bizarre experience. And then next is a photograph by Robert Doisneau titled The Indignant Lady. It depicts a comedic moment between a woman walking along a street and a painting of a nude woman presenting her butt to the viewer. The really buttoned up woman's exaggerated expression of just shock and outrage is a really stark contrast to the shameless nudity of the woman in the painting. And this photo operates within a subgenre of photography called humanistic reportage. Photographers working in this mode sought to capture the vitality of the human spirit and its ability to endure tragedies, like in the case of Robert Doisneau, the French occupation of the Second World War. Doisneau in particular was capitalizing on a sense of humor as healing, as can be seen in this image here. Doisneau produced this photograph as one in a series called Les Regards Obliques, in which he waited on this exact street corner just to capture the reactions of various people passing by this kind of scandalous painting. And then turning the corner, we see Leon Levinstein's The Screen, Child in Window, Lower East Side. Leon Levinstein's photographic project in the 1950s was centered around the citizens of New York's Lower East Side, which had a high immigrant population and generally housed New York City's urban poor. And he typically photographed people without their knowledge. He made this kind of candid portfolio of these monumentalized urban bodies. sort of a celebration of New York's average citizen. And he caught a lot of really fascinating, funny moments this way, kind of capturing the odd expressions that people make when they don't think that anyone's looking. Here, however, it's pretty apparent that the little girl knew she was being photographed, and that's probably exactly why she smushed her face against this screen like that. She's kind of putting on a little show for Levinstein's benefit, and I think this is such a fun and relatable image. I feel like most people can remember at some point in their childhood just smushing their face into screen or a glass window just to kind of pester the person on the other side. And then our last work on the walls here is Larry Fink's photograph, Greetings from Jean Sabatine, December 1983, which depicts this jolly older woman just playfully pointing a gun at the camera. While the age of the subject here is far different from the little girl in the previous photo, I like the two of them together because the spirit of the photo remains much the same. And in the 1970s, Larry Fink's artistic practice primarily comprised of photos taken at black tie society affairs, like debutante balls and gallery openings, charity benefits, and things like that. But then after tiring of this and the way that it made him feel like an outsider, he moved to Martins Creek, Pennsylvania, where he met the Sabatine family. And the Sabatines were just a stark contrast to the kind of glittering denizens of high society. So rather than photographing society balls, he started photographing events at the Sabatine residence. So like birthday parties, New Year's, graduation. And in the Sabatines, Fink found that friendship and feeling of closeness that he felt was lacking when sitting among the wealthy because they didn't really put on any pretenses. And according to Fink, Jean Sabatine, the matriarch of the family depicted here, she couldn't read or write, but she had a great love for her family and her life, and her joy in living just shines through in this moment of just stolen moment of absurdity and laughter. And then finally, the last work in the show is a sculpture in the middle of the gallery. It's titled Burt Reynolds and is a painted paddle by Tlingit artist Allison Marks. Burt Reynolds was a film star and a heartthrob, and he cemented his status as a sex symbol when he posed for a centerfold in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1972, lying across this bearskin rug. It's become just a very iconic image. And Allison Marks, a native Tlingit artist, appropriates that famous imagery of Reynolds' centerfold and places it on a paddle in a representational style typical of Tlingit art called formline design. And in addition to presenting us with the frontal view of Reynolds, which many of us were already familiar with from the centerfold, she also has invented a backside on the other side of the paddle. I apologize, the image on the screen here is a bit blurry of the backside, but she has painted Reynolds' bare bottom, which we obviously did not get to see from the photo shoot. And by doing this, Marx is commenting on the typical way that women, and in particular Native women, are represented through and for the male gaze, since by contrast here, the object of desire is a white man who was well aware of his own sexualization and objectification. And then I have a couple works that are actually not in my show. These are my honorable mentions. First, we have Fisherman's Suit by Nicolas de l'Armesson II, which is an etching from 1690. This work was pulled out of the show at the very last minute when we realized that there just was not enough physical wall space to comfortably fit it in the show. And then next is Goltzius's The Great Hercules. which has unfortunately just been out too often in the last 50 or so years. He's been too beloved and so cannot have any more exposure to light for a while, so he couldn't be out in the show. But I adore this print. The anatomy is absolutely just out of this world. He's so muscular. He looks like a loaf of like pull apart bread to me. He has just abs all the way down, abs on his knees, abs on his toes, just abs everywhere. I think this picture is hilarious. So he might not be technically in the show, but I couldn't not show him to you all. And so now, to wrap up my presentation, I'll quickly run through some challenges and considerations in curating this show. I'll stop screen sharing here since there are no more images to show. All right. So the first and most obvious difficulty was because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I started curating this show in the fall of 2019 and was largely finished with it before things started to shut down, but it did make decisions like wall color and such difficult, and scheduling, and there was a point where we thought we would have to put it in a different gallery altogether, which would entirely change the way things were set up and organized. And I also wasn't able to see most of the pieces in the show in person until right before install. However, the pandemic has made me really grateful that I chose the theme that I did, since I think it's just in times like these that we're most in need of laughter to stay strong as a community. And then beyond that, there were also some definite curatorial difficulties when deciding what should be in my show and determining what kind of humor was acceptable for my purposes here. I definitely wanted to stick to lighter humor and keep it like playful and respectful, make sure that like the works here are like punching up, not down, laughing with, not at, that sort of thing. I also deliberately excluded anything racist, I think for obvious reasons, but a great deal of the so-called funny things, funny pieces of art depicting people of color are unfortunately racist caricature based on bodily exaggeration. So definitely wanted to avoid that because I don't think it would be appropriate to have that sort of thing hanging next to these kind of like more lighthearted objects. So then it's also important to note that all the bodies depicted in this show, to the fullest extent of my knowledge, are white bodies. And this is both a result of collections limitation and also what I previously mentioned about the so-called humorous works depicting people of color being wildly offensive. That type of racial caricature is important to acknowledge and to understand, but I didn't think it would be appropriate to hang next to some of the sillier pieces in the show. And yeah, overall, I set out with the goal of making the show as diverse as possible, but that did fall a little bit flat. 5 of the 14 pieces are made by women artists. There's only one artist of color, which is Tlingit artist Allison Marks, and there are 2 openly LGBT artists in the show, which are Paul Cadmus and Andy Warhol. Again, this is largely due to collections limitations, and I'm excited for the Hood to continue to diversify its collection in the coming years. The Burt Reynolds paddle was a new acquisition, so I imagine we'll have lots more art like that coming into circulation in the next few years. But yeah, so that is, I suppose, the end of my presentation. So I think we're opening it to Q&A now. Yes?
Thanks so much, Grace. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Yes, we'd love to hear folks' questions, so please feel free to put them using the Q&A button, or you can also put them into chat. I have some questions for you, Grace. The first one is you have a huge diversity of media on display, right? You have painting, you have prints, you have photography, you have drawing. Why did you decide to use such a wide range of media? You could have been, limited it to, let's say, just photography. So was there a reason you decided to use kind of a broader approach?
I think that was primarily because well, first of all, I just wanted to kind of include as much as I possibly could in here. But I feel like there's a very different like thought process involved in like the making of work like by hand using like a paintbrush as opposed to photography. And those can kind of lend very different perspectives to the work. Also, the fact that a lot of these like painted or drawn representations can be kind of altered in ways that at least like directly on like photoshopped photography can't be. So they can kind of like morph the body in different ways, and it just kind of provides a different access point to the telling of these like bodily jokes by allowing for that kind of exaggeration in the first place that can be a little bit more difficult with photography. So yeah, I wanted to include like both humor that is like from a constructed form, and then humor from what is like actually seen in everyday life.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is, what surprised you the most when you were putting together this show?
I think what surprised me was kind of just with some of the older pieces. um I tend to kind of think, or at least I did prior to this, of older art as being kind of stuffy and stodgy and like less willing to be humorous. You think of like the photos of black and white pictures of like your great 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 grandfather, and they're just so solemn. So I feel like those really influenced the way that I viewed kind of older time periods in art. But then in these, you can see that we really just laugh about almost exactly the same things that we did back then. And that was so surprising to me that the humor can translate so directly through just multiple centuries. Um, so, yeah, that was both a real surprise to me and just such a joy when I was curating the show. I got very excited whenever I found something that was like prior to the last like century or so. So, yeah.
Excellent. And it's nice to see that humor stretching out over hundreds of years. I have another question for you about sexuality. So I wondered how you thought about sexuality. I know, like, when you were looking for body parts and specifically butts, you found a lot of sexual material in the collection. And there are some sexual pieces, a little bit. The hot dog's kind of sexual. The Doisneau is kind of sexual, but that's really about the woman looking at the painting of the woman, not the woman itself. And I would argue that really a lot of the sexuality in your show has to do with sexuality of male figures, which is counter to the prevailing cultural narrative. So the Andy Warhol butts a little bit, certainly the Paul Cadmus, which is openly homoerotic, even Alison Marks appropriating the Burt Reynolds centerfold. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about sexuality and how you thought about that intersection of sexuality and humor in the show?
Well, so when I was curating the show, I wanted to kind of encompass as broad a range of kind of the spectrum of this bodily humor as I could. So I wanted that to be from like something that is maybe completely innocent to something that maybe ranges towards the scandalous or the sexual, like the Andy Warhol Polaroids. Um, and I definitely wanted kind of in the same vein of when I was trying to be as careful as I could about like not including like racial caricature and that sort of thing. I also wanted to be careful that I wasn't really putting forth so many pieces on the wall that contributed to the male gaze. So yeah, like my favorite pieces in the show are personally of like the women taking control over their own representations of their bodies, like in the Rottenberg and the Sonia Landy Sheridan. But then, yeah, I think representing like sexual humor is something you just can't avoid when you're talking about butts. They butts are sexy. They can be completely not sexy, but they can also be entirely have sexual connotations. So I felt like to encompass that range, I had to include all of that.
All right, our next question is, what makes you laugh out loud, either something in the collection or out of the collection right now? What's continues to be funny?
Okay, so I've been kind of obsessed with the Mika Rottenberg print ever since I first saw it. It was originally shown to me, I think Jessica Hong told me to look at a different piece by Mika Rottenberg. And then when I was just looking in the collections for that, I found this one. And it was so perfect for my show. And I thought it was so hilarious. And it really, it's so relatable to me. I don't know if it's appropriate to say that I've done this before, but I have. And so it's just, it's such a funny thing. The colors are so, it's just, I almost don't even know how to describe how much I love this painting. And like, I don't know if it's kind of hard to see. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but there's like gold leaf on it. And it's just that juxtaposition of like high art, low art, and just this strangeness and absurdity, and how it kind of morphs between being like an abstract painting and just being immediately recognizable as butts. Um, I just think it's so fun. That's that's the kind of artist that I would love to be. I feel like Mika Rottenberg is out there living her best life, and good for her.
Thank you. One of the attendees points out that no images by men were of their own anatomy, but 2 images by the women were of the works you included in the show. Do you have any thoughts on this?
That's a pretty interesting observation. I know for sure, let's see, I do believe Paul Cadmus has made like self-portraiture in the past. He in particular was in like a circle of like young queer modernists in New York that did a lot of self-representation um, in kind of sexual circumstances. Um, so that in particular with the Paul Cadmus isn't necessarily it's kind of more coincidental that we just have that in the collection, if that makes sense. But then, yeah, I think it is definitely extremely important to me, especially that the depictions of women's bodies by women, um, I I just think that kind of reclaiming the female body and recontextualizing the female nude body and showing that it isn't always sexualized is a really important thing to do. And when you put that kind of in contrast with the Paul Cadmus, which is also doing kind of the exact opposite of what you would expect by taking these kind of like idealized male like athletic bodies and then making them really really sexy and objectified. I think that kind of highlights the difference between typical historical approach to the female nude as opposed to the male nude. But yeah, that was a great question. I don't think I had noticed that exactly about the self-representation and the kind of gender split down there. So thank you.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating insight. So our final question of this afternoon is, what's something that you are most proud of yourself in the process of curating this show?
Okay, let's see. I think just kind of learning to talk about these very kind of disparate pieces of art made in completely different times in a way that makes sense and unifies them all. And honestly, it's so nice just to see the work actually go up on the wall and have it be tangible. I did a whole lot of research for this show, some of which ended up like in wall labels and stuff, and some of which is just going to sit in my head until I don't know when. But it just, I don't know if there's one thing. I'm very proud of myself. I will say that. I had a lot of fun curating this show, and I feel like I learned a lot both about kind of the process of curating a show and what that entails, and also about art history and these specific works of art in general. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Grace. We are certainly proud of you as well. And I'm particularly proud of you for tackling a topic that I think some students would shy away from as maybe being not serious enough, but you took it with not only good humor, but with real academic seriousness, and brought something wonderful to life here. So thank you so much, Grace, for all your work for the show and for talking about it with us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you will join us for more events in the future. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.